The barn, well, when I go to work every day, I go on these back roads from our house over to where I work, and I've passed this farm probably hundreds of times, but this was the first time I ever noticed the truck at the end of the road. And my husband back there can tell you, I had been stalking a yellow truck for months before, and this one happened to be the next one I saw in my travels. So I take pictures of it, and I have these pictures of trucks displaying on a automatic frame at home. So I keep these trucks that I find. Yes?
Is Mr. B real?
Well, actually, this is funny. After I had taken this picture, and I started telling everyone about this truck, and I had this little story going in my head, I happened to mention this farm to my kids. And they said, you know, I think this farm belongs to a teacher that teaches at our school. And I said, really? Well, I didn't know his name, so I wrote him a letter, and it was addressed to the owner of the old blue truck. And I'm not kidding. I put it in an envelope, I dressed it and sent it to his house, and it said, I've taken a picture of your truck and it's been the inspiration for a short story. Do you mind if I stop and take more pictures? Well, you know, a few days went by and I got a phone call because I had given him my cell phone number, and he introduced himself as Mr. Boulay. And he said he was the owner of the truck, and whenever I wanted to come, I could take pictures. So I did. I went back and I took several other pictures, so I have close-up shots, so I could get all the rust on the side, and I've got the barnyard. And then he called me another time, and he goes, do you notice we have other animals? We have a goat. I took a picture of the goat. And that's how Gracie got in the story. Gracie wasn't in the original story. So and he said he had a donkey out in his pasture as well as the horses. All I could see from the road were 2 horses. I don't think he has Sadie in the piglets, but we put him in there. So that's there is a real Mr. B, Mr. Boulay. Yes?
Is it alpaca real?
Is the alpaca real? Well, Mr. B doesn't have alpacas on his farm, but there's several farms that we go by that do have alpacas. So I used this, as I'm going to work, there's another small farm. They have 2 alpacas. They're real dark, like Lily. And what I really love about them, when you first look at them, they do kind of look like a pony, and then you look a little closer and you go, their necks are a little long for a pony. And then it almost looks like their legs are on backwards. You know, they just look different, and they have this tough, curly fur, and a big swatch of fur right around their mouth. So they are very comical looking, and they're just lovely animals. So that's how Lily got in the story. Yes?
Did you ever make any other short stories?
Well, yes. Someone at work asked me that very same question. After you present this very short story, which is the title of the story, what are you going to do next? And one of the very first stories I had kind of had going in my head, probably was thought up maybe 30, 35, maybe even 40 years ago. And it's the story of the knock-kneed flamingo and the pelican doctor. So maybe at some point I can come back and present that to you. Any more questions? Yes?
Since the story was harsh, well, a lot of it was around Mr. B and his truck and his animals. Did you share this story with him?
Actually, I was waiting for this premiere performance.
Oh.
And that's why we have Jason here videotaping. We're hoping to get this up on YouTube. And then we can share it with the world. So, yes, he will get to see it. And I'm actually going to ask if he would like this to be presented to his grade. I think he's a 4th grade teacher, but I think it will still be appropriate.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, if there's no more questions. Yes?
Was there anything else that inspired you to make your other stories?
Well, it's usually just something, it might be a scene. Actually, I have one more story that's kind of in the back of my head. oh, about 2 years ago, we had all these crows in our backyard. There were thousands of crows. And one day they all left except these three. This one crow, it looked like his wing was hurt or something, and I noticed that his two buddies stayed right with him. So when he would go to eat, he'd have one crow on this side and one crow on that side, and he could go down and eat and not have to worry about another critter getting him. And then over time, I noticed he would go to our fence, and he would be on the lowest part of the fence, and he would fly down to the ground. And he'd do that over and over. And his two buddies were right up there on top. If anything came in, those crows were going to dive on him. Well, the crow eventually healed, and he's fine. So I've called that crow Rehab. And I swear he's still in our yard today, and I know there's a story that's going to come from that. Yes?
Was the goat actually named Gracie that he had?
I believe it was. I think he said that he had an old goat named Gracie, and when I took the picture, this goat probably had to be this big around, and her ears were going flat out this way, and then the horns came back. So I can ask him, but it's Gracie in our story. Bless you. Yes.
How long did it take you to come up with the story?
Well, you know, this is where it's really different. When you're thinking an oral tradition, you don't have paper and you don't have a pencil. And the stories kind of evolve in your head, and every time you tell the story, it changes just slightly. And what you're adding to the story is really your performance and having an audience right here, because you're close and right there. You're part of the story. So the story changes. This one, I would say maybe 2 to 3 weeks. As I said before, it had a beginning, a middle, and an end, but it would keep changing.
Any other questions, comments?
Yes.
I really like how, did you take, well, it's a question and a comment. I like how you made your scene, like the backgrounds, and how long did it take you to make that?
Well, that's a good question, and actually my family has asked me the same thing. I had all these drawings in my head, and I had a timeline to get them done, and everyone wondered, how are you ever going to get this done? You got so much to do. But when you have the idea in your head, it just pours out. You know, this one I did in one night, and then I started Sadie. She was done, I would say, maybe an hour for each painting, depending on if I had an idea in my head. The one problem I had is I usually paint with watercolors or oil paints. And I started doing this with magic marker, you know, the what are those markers? And it was so big, I was running out of markers, so I took it back up into my studio and I started doing watercolor on it. But I couldn't get the depth of color because of the way the background is. So I went back to marker, and like in this one, I ran out of blue sky, but I think it was okay because I got enough of it, you get the idea that they're on an adventure in the sky.
I like how you got all the ideas in your head first.
Yeah, thank you. That's just the way it goes, you know? And sometimes if you listen to what your mind's doing while you're doing something else, it'll be going on an adventure.
Nathan, do you have a question? Are you sure?
All set? Well, if you have a question later, write it down, give it to Mrs. Fegan, and she'll give it to me. And you know why she'll give it to me? Why?
Because your son's vegan and
You're right. I'm also Mrs. Fegan. I'm Mary's mother-in-law, and her husband Matthew is my son. So I'm sure I will see you again, and I will see Mary soon. And your class is back to you.
Thank you.
Thank
Another
you
round
so
of applause.
much.